We now move to Ailbhe Kenny, who's in Ireland from the University of Limerick, and she's speaking about music and research with asylum-seeking systems. You there, Ailbhe?
So today I'm going to speak to you about research I've been doing for about 6 years now into music making within asylum-seeking centres, and particularly in keeping with the theme for today, looking at the possibilities of measuring impact within these very complex settings. There have been increasing concerns about the demand for asylum globally, with now over 82 million forcibly displaced people around the world. 1/3 of these forced migrants are children. What's even more shocking, of course, about this figure is it doesn't yet include the most recent Ukrainian refugee crisis. So with my research then, I aim to bridge the two worlds of music and education, as well as the two worlds of research and practice, to holistically conceptualize, deliver, analyze, interpret, and indeed look at the impact of musical projects and experiences within asylum-seeking centres. So you get the idea there from the slide. I began this work with children, as I said, about 6 years ago, but now the work over the years has become very much intergenerational. I'm particularly focused on these temporary accommodation settings where people are first housed. You would think that that was short-term housing, but in actuality, people often spend years in these temporary accommodation settings. And I've carried out this work to date in both Ireland and Germany. I'm particularly interested in how these settings create whole new and very unique contexts where music is experienced. So from a research perspective then, these are the kind of various tools. Let me just move on to there we go. This is kind of a sneak peek into my toolbox as such, into my research toolbox. And the most important thing to say from the outset is making music with people living in these centres is the research. That is a really, really important part of the research. It's music making as research, music making as data in itself. That forms a really, really important part of trying to, as we're talking about today, measure impact, the types of musical participation that happens in these workshops. And obviously things like audio recordings, visual, photographs, you'll see lots of them in this presentation today, audio visual outputs, all important in trying to capture the impact of these music workshops within the centres. So these types of arts-based methods sit alongside more traditional qualitative methods, like you'll see here, interviews, participant observations, fieldwork notes, etc. Alongside all of that, right from the beginning of me entering this field of research, I kept a researcher reflective log. And that's been important very much from an ethical standpoint, to be ethically sensitive, obviously, within these settings, but equally the logs in themselves have provided a really, really interesting source of data for me and for the projects as time has moved on as well, in capturing journeys, insights, those informal observation, thoughts, opinions, perspectives. To date, I've worked in 8 different centres. So rather than today trying to talk through all the many projects, I've picked one. I've picked one for today to give you a snapshot of the types of impact and indeed the ways of measuring impact within these types of musical projects and contexts. So the project I'm going to talk about today was called Song Seeking. It began in autumn 2018. The idea being to set up specifically singing groups within the centres themselves, but also to connect to singers living in the local communities surrounding the centres. As with many of these projects, it involved a partnership approach. The partners involved were Sing Ireland and the Irish Refugee Council. So as you can see, having both academic and non-academic partners in this project. We received a significant grant from Creative Ireland, which for me was as a researcher, in this area for me was a massive milestone, because it meant that I was not both researcher and music facilitator in this project. It meant I was able to build capacity for other people to work in these contexts that went beyond me. And that was terribly exciting and important for the work. So I was able to hire 4 facilitators to go in and work in the centres. So I could be project lead, researcher, and be involved in their professional development. So to give you an idea of the project and the scope, just on that map there, you get a sense of the geographical spread of the project. This was an intergenerational project, and it was across 6 different centres in Ireland. How the project was kind of distinctive in a number of ways. As I said, it meant I could hire 4 different choral facilitators. It was across 6 centres. But I also was able to commission contemporary composer Sean Doherty to also work on this project. I'm going to put up this slide here. This is, out of this project, I had, one of these 100-page research reports. It's a lay report, it's publicly accessible, which is obviously important for policymakers, for resource organisations, and of course for the funder to give back, and it indeed sits on their website. But whatever hope, whatever perhaps naive hopes I might have of a policymaker reading a 100-page research report, that hope dies quite quickly, I've found over the years. But what is extremely effective is to have a graphic like this. So they may not read 100 pages, but a policymaker, a resource organisation, or even a community practitioner will look at a visual like this. So when thinking about impact and trying to disseminate impact for musical projects, I found this visual was hugely important for the project, and in getting across the idea of the scope of the project, the range of activities, the types of people involved, the range of participants, but equally, you'll see I've included the kinds of research methods that were involved. So trying to marry again that idea of research and practice, also within just a simple visual page, this 1-pager visual, really, really important when thinking about how you're going to disseminate, to talk about impact to multiple audiences. We also hosted, as part of this project, Sing-In events. These were quite interesting in that it was trying to reach beyond the centres themselves to the local communities surrounding the centres. So inviting in local singers, local groups, musical groups, singing groups into the centres themselves to, share music with people who are living in their communities, but are often very segregated, very marginalised, and very hidden. Also, the vast majority of the people who came into the centres for these music making days, it was the first time they'd ever set foot in these centres. So again, that was hugely important in trying to connect to local communities. We have a song-seeking songbook that came out of that commission with the contemporary composer who himself went around the centres and composed with the participants, and that influenced that songbook, which is a direct legacy, in fact, of the project. And finally, then we had one of these, big celebratory events in the National Concert Hall in Dublin, bringing people from all over Ireland up to Dublin for a big celebratory event. And indeed, that extended the partnership, because the National Concert Hall gifted us the space for the day. Research then was embedded right from the outset and throughout the development of the project. And no matter what research I've done over the years in this field and others, that is critical, that the research just doesn't come in at the end, that it's there from the outside, it's embedded, it's threaded throughout these musical projects. So you've seen the figures, but of course, capturing and hearing the voices of the participants, really important within this workshop, trying to gain deep insights into what people experienced. And I hope these quotes give you a sense of that. The singing sessions within the centres then created meaningful integration opportunities through shared music making and performance across the diverse communities of the people living there. So the first port of call was to make connections with people in the centres who are actually a very, very diverse group. People from all sorts of racial backgrounds, ethno backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, a real mix of people who, again, you know, find it very difficult to make connections within these centres, as well as then with the other events, trying to connect with the outside communities. The project sessions then, as you'll see from these quotes, were perceived as a way to release stress and tension, as a coping mechanism, and a way to alleviate boredom. And what was really interesting is this was the case not just with the adults, but as you can see from the quotes, also for the children. As regards access and inclusion, it did expand access to group singing and musical opportunity, because in every centre we went to, there was no facilitated musical opportunities or activities happening. The sing-ins in particular, the ones I was mentioning about bringing in the local communities, they were a particular highlight. And just to give you a sense of the numbers of that, we had 200 people who came and took part in those singing events. We had people who brought babies in arms, and we had people well into their later years. There was a huge appetite for people to connect with what we call in Ireland these new communities, people who've newly arrived. A huge appetite. In fact, I had so much interest, I had to, you know, I wasn't even able to fit the amount of people that wanted to come to the centres. So that in itself was a very interesting finding. The big singing itself in the National Concert Hall, as well as inputting to the songbook, resulted in feelings of immense pride and inclusion. The performances included many genres, including contemporary urban music. And on the day, you know, we had people sharing spoken word pieces, hip hop, you know, original songs, original instrumental music as well. Putting people seeking asylum, people so excluded, on stage at a prominent Irish cultural institution turned out to be quite the political statement. And we attracted a lot of media attention because of that event. We were on the national news that night. We had national newspapers who did articles on it that weekend. We had national radio, local radio. You know, I was overwhelmed with the amount of media attention that this project got. And of course, it was because of those macro themes of diversity. It was, you know, in what's often very negative stories about asylum-seeking communities, this was a good news story. That was quite an interesting dimension to the project. Again, in thinking of terms of impact and how to disseminate beyond an academic audience. I also want to talk briefly about the impact on the choral facilitators, because of course that was another aspect of impact of the project and how they had to reimagine their practices, transform their practices in many ways, and how that has gone on to transform their facilitation practices. These were very professionally well-established people, but working in these centres was very, very new to them. And this was a complex process, and it challenged their previous experiences and knowledge of learning relationships and indeed of music facilitation. And again, I hope that you get a sense just from the quotes that you're reading on your screen there of that. And I've written a whole article actually just on the choral facilitators' experiences of this project. What transpired, and actually this relates back nicely to Phil Mullen's quote at the start of the presentation. The most important approach within the project was a responsive one, to respond to the people in front of them, to be flexible to that. And again, I think you get a sense of that just from those few quotes. Regarding dissemination then and impact, I mean, what's all important for me in these projects is that you need different means and modes of dissemination for different audiences. It's never the one audience you're speaking to about impact in these projects. The funder wants to hear a different story to the academic, who wants to hear a different story to the practitioner, who wants to hear a different story to the participant. There are different ways of dissemination, and there have to be nuanced ways of trying to do that. I'm not saying I've always gotten it right. I'm still learning in that regard. And I see Pam is dinging. Okay, Pam. But this is just to give you a sense. There's things like the Public Lay Report, the Songbook, the media themselves, academic publications. There's a YouTube link I won't get to play today, but by all means, it'll be on the slides. Do click into it. And that was a legacy that we had to connect to the singing communities during the pandemic. And of course, talks like this. There's just some relevant publications. Again, they'll be on the slides. Do look it up, and a YouTube link for anyone who is interested in following up on that. Thank you for listening.